February 3rd, 2023. Somewhere around 9 in the evening in a small town called East Palestine, Ohio, a Norfolk Southern freight train is rolling through like it has done thousands of times before, and nobody on board has any idea that in about 30 seconds their lives are going to change forever, and so will the lives of everyone living within miles of those tracks. The train is almost 2 miles long, 149 cars behind 3 locomotives. Somewhere around the 23rd car back, a wheel bearing has been getting hotter and hotter for the past 20 miles, climbing past 200 degrees above the outside air temperature, and the wayside detector that just scanned it is now screaming at the crew to stop the train immediately. The engineer slams on the brakes, but you cannot stop 18,000 tons of rolling steel in a few hundred feet. Before anyone can do anything about it, the axle snaps clean off. 38 cars pile into each other, 11 of them carrying hazardous materials, and within minutes the whole thing is burning so hot that the firefighters cannot even get close to it. This is where most people stopped paying attention, because the news cycle moved on to the next disaster. The politicians made their speeches, Norfolk Southern wrote some checks, and everyone assumed this was just one of those terrible accidents that happen sometimes in a complicated world. But if you actually dig into what happened in East Palestine, Ohio, if you follow the trail of decisions and policy changes and corporate strategies that led to that bearing failing on that particular night, you end up somewhere very different from where you expected. You end up on Wall Street. You end up in boardrooms where people who have never set foot on a locomotive in their lives are making decisions about how American railroads should operate. And you end up asking a question that nobody in the railroad industry wants to answer honestly, which is whether the entire business model that has taken over American freight railroads in the past decade is fundamentally incompatible with running a safe operation. The story starts with a man named Hunter Harrison, and if you worked on the railroads any time in the last 30 years, you either loved him or you hated him. But either way, you knew exactly who he was. Harrison started his career at the bottom, working as a carman oiler for the Frisco Railway back in 1964, and he spent decades climbing through the ranks until he became one of the most influential railroad executives in North American history. He ran Illinois Central, then Canadian National, then Canadian Pacific, and finally CSX, and at every single one of those companies he implemented something called precision scheduled railroading, which sounds like a boring operational term, but is actually the most consequential change to hit the American railroad industry since deregulation in 1980. The basic idea behind precision scheduled railroading, or PSR as everyone calls it, is that you run trains on fixed schedules like passenger trains instead of waiting until you have enough freight cars to make a full load. You reduce the inventory of locomotives and freight cars sitting around in yards. You simplify your routes, you cut your workforce, and you measure everything by something called the operating ratio, which is simply how much money you spend to earn $1 of revenue. The lower your operating ratio, the more efficient you are, and the happier your shareholders become. Now, on paper this sounds perfectly reasonable. Who could argue against efficiency? Who could argue against running a tighter operation? But here is what PSR looks like in practice when you hand the keys to people whose primary loyalty is to quarterly earnings reports and stock prices, rather than to the long-term health of the railroad. When Hunter Harrison took over Canadian Pacific in 2012, the company's operating ratio was sitting at 81.3%, which Wall Street considered bloated and inefficient. He was brought in specifically by a hedge fund manager named Bill Ackman, whose firm Pershing Square Capital had been accumulating CP stock and wanted to see dramatic changes. Within 5 years, Harrison had slashed that operating ratio down to 58.6%, the best in the industry. The stock price doubled, shareholders made billions, and the way he did it was by cutting 34% of the workforce and tripling the profit generated by each remaining worker. He did the same thing at every railroad he touched. When he moved to CSX in 2017, he immediately started laying off workers, closing rail yards, and running longer trains with fewer people. And here is the thing that really matters. Harrison became the model that every other railroad executive was expected to follow. His protégés spread out across the industry. 6 of the 7 major North American freight railroads adopted some version of precision-scheduled railroading. The only holdout was BNSF, which is owned by Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway and does not have to answer to activist investors demanding immediate returns. And by pure coincidence, BNSF was the only Class 1 railroad whose safety record actually improved in 2018, while everyone else was getting worse. The numbers tell the story better than any analysis ever could. Between April 2015 and June 2021, the Class 1 railroads collectively cut their workforce from 174,000 workers down to 116,000. That is a 33% reduction in 6 years. Union Pacific went from 37,500 employees in 2016 to 26,700 in 2022, a drop of nearly 29%, while their freight volume only declined by 3%. They were moving almost the same amount of stuff with almost a third fewer people. And where did all that savings go? You might think it went into upgrading the tracks, buying better equipment, installing more safety systems, but the unions did the math. And between 2015 and 2022, the 6 biggest freight railroads spent over $165 billion on stock buybacks. That is money taken out of the company and handed directly to shareholders. During the same period, they spent only $119 billion on actually maintaining and upgrading their tracks and equipment. The Surface Transportation Board calculated that from 2010 through 2021, railroad owners brought in $183 billion in dividends and buybacks, compared to only $138 billion spent on infrastructure. The priorities could not be more clear. The people who got squeezed hardest were the carmen, the skilled workers who actually inspect the freight cars before they go out on the line. These are the folks who walk along the train checking wheels, bearings, brakes, couplers, all the things that can fail catastrophically if nobody catches them in time. The Class 1 railroads have cut the number of mechanical department employees by over 41% since 2015. The carmen who remain are being pressured to do their inspections faster and faster, checking each car in a minute or less when there are at least 90 different points on each side of a rail car that are supposed to be examined. The Federal Railroad Administration did a study on this, and what they found was disturbing. When federal inspectors were watching, the railroads allowed an average of 1 minute and 38 seconds per car for inspections. But when the inspectors were not watching, internal documents showed that inspections were being completed in about 44 seconds per car. You cannot check 90 points in 44 seconds. You cannot even walk the length of a freight car in 44 seconds. What you can do is glance at it, hope nothing looks obviously wrong, and move on to the next one because your supervisor is breathing down your neck about keeping the trains moving. After East Palestine, the Federal Railroad Administration went back and inspected the cars that had been on that train, and they found defects in 25% of the 77 cars they reviewed. 1 in 4 cars had something wrong with it, and the National Transportation Safety Board hearing revealed that most of the cars on that train had never received a full mechanical inspection before being added to the consist. The bearing that failed had been getting hotter across multiple wayside detectors, showing a clear trend of increasing temperature. But the company's procedures did not require the crew to stop until the final detector screamed that it was already too late. Union Pacific has similar problems. In July and August of 2023, the Federal Railroad Administration conducted focused inspections at Union Pacific's massive yard in North Platte, Nebraska, and they found defects on nearly 73% of the outbound locomotives. 73%. And 20% of the freight cars had issues too. These are trains that were about to go out on the main line carrying freight across the country, and 3/4 of the locomotives had something wrong with them. Meanwhile, the trains themselves keep getting longer. Back in 2008, the average freight train on a Class 1 railroad was maybe 3/4 of a mile long. By 2017, data from 2 major railroads showed average lengths of 1.2 to 1.4 miles, an increase of about 25%. In 2023, the median train length was over 5,000 feet, which is basically a mile. 10% of all trains were longer than 9,600 feet. Some railroads are regularly running trains that stretch nearly 3 miles from end to end, trains so long that the crew in the front cannot see what is happening to the cars 2 miles behind them. Longer trains save money because you need fewer crews to move the same amount of freight. But they also create problems that shorter trains do not have. The physics get more complicated. There is more slack running through the couplers, which means more forces being transmitted back and forth when the engineer applies power or brakes. There are more opportunities for something to go wrong in the middle of the train where nobody can see it. And when something does go wrong, the consequences tend to be bigger because there is simply more train to pile up. In 2019, a Union Pacific train derailed in Nevada, and the NTSB investigation found that the cause was excessive slack action created by the train's makeup. The train was 2.2 miles long, and parts of it were going uphill while other parts were going downhill at the same time, creating forces that the crew could not control. Engineers need specialized training to handle trains this long, but the training programs have not kept pace with the changes in train length. And then there is the question of who is actually making the decisions about how these railroads operate. Martin Oberman served as chairman of the Surface Transportation Board, the federal agency that oversees freight rail economics, and he has been warning for years about what is happening. He says the industry as a whole has followed the path of being under pressure from Wall Street, with investors pushing railroads to thin workforces and delay safety upgrades while using the savings to enrich shareholders. The hedge funds and activist investors who pushed PSR onto the industry are not railroad people. They are financial engineers whose expertise is in extracting value from companies, not in running complex transportation networks safely. The case of Norfolk Southern makes this painfully clear. In October 2018, Norfolk Southern implemented their version of precision-scheduled railroading, and almost immediately their accident rate started climbing. From 2018 to 2022, their rate of accidents per million train miles rose faster than any of their competitors. They had 3 system-wide meltdowns in the 11 years before East Palestine, the worst rate in the industry. And now their own shareholders are suing them, claiming that the company systematically dismantled its safety infrastructure in an all-out pursuit of profits. Think about that for a second. The investors who benefited from all those stock buybacks, who cheered when the operating ratio dropped and the stock price climbed, are now turning around and suing the company because they finally realized what PSR actually meant on the ground level. The shareholder lawsuit alleges that Norfolk Southern's use of longer, heavier trains staffed by fewer personnel led to increased train derailments and a materially increased risk of future derailments. It alleges that PSR was part of a culture of increased risk-taking at the expense of reasonable safety precautions due to the company's near-term focus solely on profits. These are not union activists making these claims. These are the shareholders themselves. Hugh Sawyer, a nearly 4-decade veteran engineer at Norfolk Southern, put it bluntly after East Palestine. He said it was a major public relations disaster that was going to happen to some railroad because this goes on every day. In his opinion, what happened because they had cut corners. The Federal Railroad Administration Administrator, Amit Bose, testified before Congress that railroad safety performance has stagnated over the last decade, and by some measures has actually deteriorated. Despite assertions to the contrary from the industry, derailment rates for the nation's largest rail companies have not significantly improved. The rate of accidents per million miles that freight trains travel increased from 15.572 to 16.695 over the past decade. The rate of accidents inside rail yards got worse too, climbing from 11 in 2013 to 15.5 in 2022. The railroads will tell you that they are safer than ever, and technically they can point to statistics that show overall accident numbers declining. But what the unions argue, and what the data seems to support, is that the industry has been manipulating the comparison by measuring against particularly bad years and by citing absolute numbers rather than rates that account for the fact that they are running fewer but longer trains. The infrastructure situation is complicated by the fact that the Class 1 railroads do not publicly report deferred maintenance the way some other infrastructure owners do. They claim to spend about 18% of their revenue on capital expenditures, which sounds substantial. But when you compare that to the money flowing out to shareholders, and when you look at the condition of equipment that federal inspectors are finding when they actually go out and check, you have to wonder whether the priorities are where they should be. Short-line railroads, the smaller operators who handle the last-mile connections and feed traffic to the big Class 1s, are in even worse shape. Many of them inherited track that was already in need of maintenance and upgrades that had been deferred by the legacy owners who sold them the lines. According to industry estimates, only about 48% of short-line track and 53% of short-line bridges can handle the current industry standard car weight of 286,000 pounds. These smaller railroads are investing at least 25% of their annual revenue just trying to catch up, but the challenges remain enormous. And here is where all of this connects back to the bigger picture of American infrastructure and industrial policy. The freight railroads are privately owned, which means they fund their own operations and maintenance rather than relying on tax dollars the way highways and airports do. In theory, this should create strong incentives for efficiency and good management. In practice, it has created a situation where financial engineering takes precedence over operational engineering, where the smartest people in the room are the ones figuring out how to extract the most value in the shortest time, rather than the ones figuring out how to move freight safely and reliably for the next 50 years. The trains are still running. Freight is still moving. 3 derailments happen every day in this country, but most of them are minor yard accidents that never make the news. The system has not collapsed. The railroads will tell you that they carry hazardous materials more safely than any alternative, and statistically, that is probably true. Trucks have their own problems, and there is no other practical way to move the volume of bulk commodities that keep the American economy functioning. The workforce that built and maintained these railroads for generations has been systematically reduced. The institutional knowledge that comes from having experienced carmen, engineers, and maintenance workers is walking out the door and not being replaced. The trains are longer, the crews are smaller, the inspections are faster, and the investors are richer. Everyone is hoping that technology will somehow make up for the humans who used to catch problems before they became disasters. Norfolk Southern says they have changed since East Palestine. They have hired a new chief safety officer. They have invested hundreds of millions of dollars in new detectors and inspection technology. They have extended their training programs from 4 weeks to 5 weeks. They say they are building a new safety culture at a company that, before the derailment, had the fastest growing accident rate in the industry. Maybe they mean it. Maybe the shock of East Palestine, the shareholder lawsuits, the congressional hearings, and the billions in costs will actually change how the industry operates. Or maybe the pressure from Wall Street will eventually reassert itself. The operating ratios will start creeping back down. The workforce cuts will resume, And we will be having this same conversation again after the next disaster forces everyone to pay attention for a few months before moving on. The Federal Railroad Administration says it needs more research to determine whether the current operating model is actually unsafe. The industry says the railroads are in the best condition they have ever been. The unions say their members are being stretched thin and pressured to cut corners. The shareholders, the same ones who pushed for all these changes in the first place, are now suing because they got exactly what they asked for, and it turned out to have consequences they did not anticipate. That is where American railroads stand right now.